that today there are threats to security of a new and unprecedented kind. These threats do not divide us. They are threats which should unite us, no matter from which part of the world we come, for they face us all. They are rising global temperatures, the despoiling of the ocean, that vast universal larder on which people everywhere depend for their food. Changes in the pattern of weather worldwide that pay no regard to national boundaries, but that can turn forests into deserts, drown great cities, and lead to the extermination of huge numbers of the other creatures with which we share this planet. No matter what we do now, some of these threats will assuredly become reality within a few short years.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another edition of Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis. That was Sir David Attenborough speaking to the UN Security Council this week. The broadcaster and conservationist told the UN Security Conference regarding the impact of climate change that the world must unite against environmental threats. Sir David Attenborough notes consequences of climate change do not respect national boundaries, but instead will cause havoc worldwide. And it's happening. In California, forest fires. In Texas, winter storms. This year alone has seen a series of devastating climate disasters in various parts of the world. Heat waves in India, Pakistan, and Europe. Flooding in Southeast Asia. From Mozambique to Bangladesh, millions of people have already lost their homes, livelihoods, and loved ones as a result of more dangerous and more frequent extreme weather events. Increases of air and water temperatures lead to rising sea levels, supercharged storms, and higher wind speeds, more intense and prolonged droughts and wildfire seasons, heavier precipitation, and flooding. The evidence is overwhelming and results are devastating. Global warming is not a debate, it's science. And if you're still wondering if it's occurring, then you're vastly uninformed and misled by fringe political leaders who place profit over environmental concerns. The number of climate-related disasters has tripled in the last 30 years. Get this, between 2006 and 2016, the rate of global sea level rise was 2.5 times faster than it was for almost all of the 20th century. More than 20 million people are forced from their homes by climate change. The United Nations Environment Program estimates that adapting to climate change and coping with damages will cost developing countries $140 to $300 billion per year by 2030. On this backstory, we talked to an expert on national security and the environment, and the World Wildlife Fund on how freshwater fish are now going extinct by the dozens. All right, Jeff Opperman is the World Wildlife Federation's freshwater lead scientist. And Jeff, you're based in Ohio.
Yes, that's correct.
Thanks for doing this. I am shocked by the numbers. I mean, the WWF and 16 conservation groups came out with this report, and they're saying that a third of freshwater fish species are threatened by extinction.
Yeah, it's a pretty grim statistic, and it really there's been a raft of studies that have shown that freshwater ecosystems and freshwater species are more imperiled than their counterparts on land or in oceans, and it really is something that most people are not aware of, in part because freshwater species and the ecosystems are literally hidden beneath the surface, so to speak. But whenever scientists look into these kinds of patterns, the greatest threats, the greatest risk of extinction, the greatest declines, all are happening in freshwater ecosystems like lakes and rivers.
How do we get to this idea of saying that they are threatened by extinction? Is there any kind of overstate in there, or do you believe that these are genuine, accurate numbers?
Well, scientists do have thresholds of population sizes that are that they use to use to back up expressions like threatened with extinction. And so, for example, IUCN has what they call the red list, and they have classifications of species. And I'm forgetting the specific classifications, but essentially things like threatened, at risk of extinction, different gradations, different levels. And those
they're not endangered. They're saying threatened by extinction.
Right. So that's the classification.
As severe as it gets.
Right. I mean, that's based on trajectories. It's based on total population sizes. To be classified in that category is meaning you have moved beyond endangered. Moving into something where you're truly at risk of extinction.
And as we say, this is just not one conservation group. This is 16 of very reputable conservation groups around the world talking about this. Why is it happening? Let's talk about it.
So there's a pretty diverse range of drivers and threats to freshwater ecosystems. So most people instinctively think about water pollution. They think that, well, if freshwater ecosystems are declining, it's because of dirty water. And certainly water pollution is a major factor in some parts of the world more than others. But even in places that have really cleaned up their waters, you're still seeing ecosystems that aren't really recovering or species that are threatened because there are so many other threats, including the infrastructure that we use to manage our rivers. So that's dams and levees. And we use this infrastructure generally to control where water goes. We like to put water in certain places and keep water from going to other places. But ecosystems have always thrived on connectivity of water being able to move to connect from rivers to wetlands, or for fish to be able to swim up long distances on rivers. And our infrastructure, our dams and our levees, our flood walls, all of those are intended to fragment. And so while ecosystems thrive on connectivity, our infrastructure is intended to separate and fragment, and that has major disruptions for how freshwater ecosystems function. So there's something, you could have very clean water, but if you have a fragmented system, species like fish are going to have a lot of problems.
I live on a farm north of Toronto. When I'm not in London, that's where I grew up. And we have this beautiful river that runs through there, and it runs for miles. It's north of Toronto in Ontario. And, when I took my kids there, they were like, let's dam this, and make a pond. Right. And then put fish in it. And then the conservation people, they're really great, I think, in Canada generally. They came through and they walked those farms, and they came through and said, can we walk across the farm? And we started talking about the river with my kids, which is a great education. And they were saying, don't dam it. Don't clear the grass away from it. And then they started showing us all the species of little fish in there that we didn't even realize were there. And they're traveling, dozens and dozens of miles. The best thing you can do with a river is let it run.
Yeah, it's funny. Little kids have that instinct. I think you see it anywhere. Small streams. If you're in a park, you often see remnants of where somebody piled up the stones. And so, sure, there is this instinct. It's kind of beavers have the same instinct. They see running water, they want to dam it up. But exactly. When rivers flow and when they can connect different parts of the landscape, that's when ecosystems are at their most productive and diverse.
Populations of large species weighing more than 60 pounds have fallen more than a catastrophic 94%. And then they talked about 80 freshwater species under pressure, with 16 already disappearing in 2020. What are we doing? What are we doing?
So the first stat you cited was about what are called megafauna. So literally just big animals, and freshwater fish megafauna have been particularly hit hard. The 94% decline since 1970 you cited. A lot of that has to do with what I was just talking about, the fragmentation. So big animals in particular need room to roam, right? We think about the big carnivores. You still have them well north of Ontario. You still have wolves and such, but in most of the United States, the landscape is fragmented, and so we can't support wolves. Tigers are being hemmed in. The landscape, tigers need vast space. Well, freshwater fish megafauna are the same thing. They need large areas, and they need them to be connected. They need to move from one to the other, like the Mekong giant catfish.
But they're
So
obviously not going to be in rivers, most of them, right? I mean, we're talking about something that big. You're probably talking about the Great Lakes in Canada, for instance.
No, we are talking
and on
rivers.
The U.S. border too. Sorry.
Yeah, no, we are talking rivers about some of this megafauna. I mean, the Mekong giant catfish. It's an herbivore. It eats plants and algae in rivers, but it weighs as much as a grizzly bear. The Mekong freshwater stingray is this massive, flat, stingray shape that it could drape over a king-size bed and be, touching the floor. That's how massive they are. The Beluga Sturgeon, it's mostly in the ocean, but it's anadromous, so it swims up rivers to spawn. And this was the size of a great white shark. So rivers, big rivers, are capable of supporting huge animals. Yeah.
Yeah, it's incredible. And I mean, there's so much going on, and even big bodies of water too. I mean, as the rivers flow into the Great Lakes, that they've been the water levels have been falling. There's a lot of fish farming going on, which adds to huge pollution inside the Great Lakes as well, and overfishing. Although some people saying in the pandemic there's actually been some positive things, and that is there's been less tourism and less people putting pressure on the ecosystem.
Well, there's a lot of interesting stories that come out about how our presence affects animals and their behavior. And this was, I think, it is one of the interesting insights. Just our presence, just the sounds that we make, the boat noises, the movements, species adjust their behavior to avoid those things, realizing that, our presence does influence. And hopefully there's ways that we pick up important insights from that. And it's important that people are out enjoying lakes and rivers and fishing and taking advantage of all that, because we need people to really be connected. Another form of connectivity. We need people connected to their lakes and rivers. But if we have insights about how, movements or people's behavior can be adjusted to make it better for animals, that would be great.
Is there a way to just not talk about this? But if you were to press the button and give me your headline solution, probably on the top of your list, what we need to do right now, like yesterday, to save these species, what is it?
Let's see. We could have a headline that says solar panels save migratory fish. And, that might be a bit of an unexpected headline. But what I'm talking about here is, and I keep talking about, is this idea of migratory fish and large fish. They need room to roam. They need connectivity. They need to be able to swim up rivers. And the biggest source of fragmentation of big rivers has been hydropower dams. And there are still thousands of hydropower dams planned in rivers around the world. So only about a third of long rivers are still considered free-flowing, meaning they're not fragmented by dams. And many of those
is that like over the last 100 years or so, or that we've lost 2/3?
Yes, I would say, because a dam capable of fragmenting a big river has only been possible since the early 1900s. If we start thinking about, Hoover Dam at its time was this incredible engineering accomplishment because it was a big dam on a big river. And so since then, the 1920s, 1930s, there have been dams. We've dammed most of our major rivers, most of, Danube, Rhine, most of Europe's major rivers. And so if you look at a map of the long free-flowing rivers, those that remain are in the Amazon basin, they're in the Congo basin, there's a few in Asia, and then in the far north in Siberia and flowing towards the Arctic Ocean, where there really aren't people. But where there are people, it's really in the tropics that we have these long free-flowing rivers. That's exactly where the proposals for future hydropower dams, the tributaries of the Amazon, the Mekong River, the Irrawaddy River, these are also the rivers that still support huge migratory runs of fish and the big freshwater megafauna, the giant catfish. And hydropower is increasingly less competitive as a source of energy compared to wind and solar, because their cost has been dropping so precipitously. And there's been a range of battery storage and other storage options and grid management. It's call it the renewable revolution. And this renewable revolution is making it so that countries don't have to make this really tough decision. Do we dam this river to get a lot of electricity, but we lose so many of the values of this river, often displacing, lots of communities and farmland, but fragmenting the river and losing the fisheries. Countries don't have to make that trade-off anymore because we have a lot more diverse sources of low carbon energy now. So that would be my headline. Solar panel saves the catfish, or something like that.
I was just talking to a security expert this week on the converging risks of ecological disruption, and that's with the Council of Strategic Risks in the United States. I'm going to run that interview together with yours, but it's interesting that they're saying, it shouldn't be a conservation conversation that takes place outside of all the other critical organizations of government now, because these big conversations about conservation, because they're not being had in the right places, what you're seeing is threats to national security of all sorts of countries, because it goes beyond just what species you want to protect, but the displacement of people, the lack of water. It's threatening the planet, right?
Well, this report, the Forgotten Fishes report, does a really good job of highlighting the nutritional value, the food security value of rivers. And dams often are built in one country and then affect the food security value of a downstream country. And all of that is directly related to stability, security. So yeah, it's exactly. I think we need to not just be trying to get the Ministry of Environment to be talking about these issues or making decisions. We need to be talking to the ministries of finance and planning and energy and agriculture, the people that oversee food security, because the rivers and things like fisheries are fully integrated into the economies and security and stability of countries. So yeah, we need to not just think that this is about protecting species, which is important. It's central to the functioning and stability of many countries.
And we need to support conservation groups and organizations like the World Wildlife Federation and Jeff Opperman for his work in there. But one thing a lot of people don't know about Jeff, which I have now learned about because of the person from the WWF, told me that you have put together a history of beer through beer labels. And I actually, because I had a few minutes before the interview, took a look at it, and your research is obviously flawed because I did not see any Canadian beer in there.
Right above me here, I have my collection of river and fish themed beer bottles. I do have a Canadian one. I think it was a little complicated because it had a hydropower dam on the label, so it's a river themed. But I wasn't sure if I could work that in.
Counterintuitive to conservation. What was you don't remember the name of the beer, do you?
It would take me a second to find it.
Don't worry. I know it's a long list. And then you have also on YouTube put together a list of river songs.
Well, I think that both the beer labels and the river songs, what they speak to is this incredible intertwining of culture and rivers from time immemorial. We are river species. We are river valley species. That is where the first settlements occurred. They've always been the areas of incredible productivity, whether it's fishing or waterfowl or in the dry season. And transportation, right? And so really, we as civilizations grew up around rivers, and so it's sort of reflected. We paint our origins, and so that's why we put it on our beer labels. It's reminding us of where we come from. We come from a people who settled along rivers to brew beer, and we wrote songs about it. Yeah, so there's the number of songs about rivers is really quite amazing.
Go sit on the riverbank and have a beer and sing a song, and don't build a bloody dam there.
Right. Yeah, a lot of ways to connect to your river, and if we can avoid disconnecting our rivers, that's a bonus.
Jeff Opperman from the World Wildlife Federation. Great to talk to you. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you. Great to talk with you.
All right, joining me now is Rod Schoonover, the author of the report, The Security Risk That Binds Us. Hi, Rod. You're in Washington.
I'm in Washington. Happy to be with you.
You were also the former director of Environment and Natural Resources at the National Intelligence Council.
Right.
And it really interests me that we now begin to look at ecological disruption and networks that you talk about, fraying ecological networks as security risks, nation security risks.
Right.
Why is that?
Well, I mean, it has to do with humans' relationship with the planet that's changing under our feet. And so basically, the overarching concept is that human activities are producing new and rapid and foundational changes across multiple Earth systems, in the atmosphere, water, the ocean, and in our biological systems as well.
You wrote that the U.S. and international security communities need to treat ecological disruption and climate change as conduits of national security threats rather than mere environmental concerns.
Correct.
I mean, haven't we always looked at these as some kind of security threats in the sense that, there have been tensions over water and borders between states and
Sure.
in migration, people displaced,
Sure.
because of environmental issues?
Sure. I mean, certainly some parts of that, like water, and some elements of climate change easily enter into the typical security doctrine, right? Like people can think about water security issues because they understand that people and nations have tensions over water shortages or water stress. So yeah, certainly water, the water story is not new, but I think a lot of people don't look at deforestation or fisheries declines or, extinction rates of organisms as being anything more than an unfortunate phenomenon happening that may or may not have an effect to people in this country and others.
And you're telling governments, if you're not an environmental leaning government, you better wake up anyway, because this can affect the security of your nation. Right.
And just to be clear, I mean, although it is easily discussed in an environmental framework, I don't really see it that way. I see it as a set of issues, a set of stresses that are affecting people, societies, and the systems that they're dependent on. And so, in terms of economics and labor and food security, these are all issues that countries, national leaders, not only should care about, they do care about it, but they often don't tie these things together. And so, if you read news stories, you can see, every couple of weeks a story about some bad ecological thing happening. You'll see some report about just this morning about something like a third of freshwater fisheries are in jeopardy of extinction. The consequences to people are enormous. And so, it's just about, helping security officials and policymakers and the general public make those connections. These are not just the purview of the headlines in National Geographic or some other environmental press. These are things that will affect people.
When you look at things like snowstorms in Texas or forest fires in California, you guys can't even agree on that in the United States and unite a country on those issues. How in the world do you get kind of global consensus when these issues are often just politicized and somebody blames, Washington blames the state or, one party blames the other's environmental, promotion of green power. It becomes really politicized, right? And there should be consensus. There needs to be dramatic consensus to move forward on some of this stuff.
Right. I mean, you're putting your finger on an enormous problem that we have in terms of basic statements of fact being politicized. Now, I think there is probably some reasonable disagreement on, the environmental underpinnings of the weird Texas freeze out, but in terms of things like wildfires and pandemic origins, things like that, I think the more that we hew to science, and we need science and the nonpartisan underpinning of science more than ever. And so, but I agree it's a problem. And whether it's disinformation or information balkanization or what have you, I think it's a great problem of the coming decades. If we can't agree on the problem set, it's hard to move to a solution set.
That's a great way to put this perplexing and disturbing, disinformation age, especially in the U.S. right now.
Right.
When you try to talk about things like global warming and the fact, Biden is re-entering the Paris Accords, and meanwhile, the Republican Party, to a large degree, is still in denial even of global warming, and that more than probably any other lightning rod, and I should be asking you, not telling you, I would think that more than any other lightning rod has the ability to displace huge amounts of people, economies, and cause great insecurity around the globe.
Right. And I would just add to that, not just has the capacity, but at least a certain amount of that is almost certain to transpire. And so we know, irrespective of which, policies in terms of greenhouse gases and, other things with climate change, we know that some fraction of that is going to transpire. And so, it's really incumbent on, security officials and policymakers to do something about the change that is coming. And one thing I will just add, I spent a decade in the intelligence community, and I did more than my share of briefing of officials in both Democratic and Republican administrations, and also on the Hill. There's a lot more common ground than I think people realize, especially younger people. Even when they're Republican, they very often embrace, the science and want to do something about it. And so I think
I need to hear that, because a lot of us feel that people are living in denial, and in Washington, some of them. I used to joke that I had never met a climate denier in Washington when the doors were closed. But when the doors were open and the cameras were on, it was a different story. And they did that because of industry and lobbying pressure.
Well, I mean, presumably. I mean, you never know what motivates people to take one position, publicly and another one privately. But, certainly, the way that our politics are run in the United States, and, how money fuels it. I suspect that's part of the Are
you alarmed at the pace at which we're seeing what you called biological annihilation? Mm-hmm. And there's a long chart in that report.
Right.
When you go through some of it, are you alarmed at the pace, just not in the last 10 years, but even in the last few years, as we're getting better at charting some of this? It's some of the stuff is pretty shocking.
Right. Well, so the term biological annihilation isn't the one that I use. It's actually used by some pretty preeminent ecologists. And when I read it, when I was still in government, I read a scientific paper. It just shook me. When you work in this space, you're aware of general global trends and ecological trends. But when you read that kind of language, by people who've devoted their life to studying ecological systems. It's very, for me, it was very sobering. And so, yes, I am alarmed by extinction rates. You hear many, and you can read many scientists argue that we're entering, or at the beginning of a sixth mass extinction. If that's true, we're in deep trouble, and it will have more than just effects on societies and nations. I mean, we're really creeping up on existential, crisis. The thing about extinctions of species and populations and biodiversity loss and a lot of those issues is the rebound. If we as societies quit doing some of these practices, the rebound is quite rapid, right? If we cut down on deforestation, cut down on wildlife trade, cut down on overfishing and overlogging, nature does rebound. In fact, I think we should see this kind of policy and these kinds of actions as a way to bolster our resilience against climate change, pandemic risk, et cetera, these other threats. This is one that has a direct human fingerprint on it that, if you're looking for solutions, you just dial that back.
I want to talk to you about your recommendations in a second at the end of it, because that's really the punchline. But you also talked about, there's a section in there in pandemics and large scale epidemics becoming more frequent. And obviously you take the position that, the movie we find ourselves in, COVID-19, along with, dengue, cholera, Ebola, that these are all, zoonotic spillover events from animals to humans because of these security threats of the environment.
Yeah, I mean, basically, human activities are increasing the human-wildlife interface. And there's a tremendous amount of microbial diversity in the natural systems as we cross into and lower that threshold between human wildlife and humans and wildlife and livestock. Then we expose ourselves to, I think scientists estimate something like 1.7 million undiscovered viruses that animals and mammals and birds harbor, and that cannot just pass to us directly, but pass through our livestock systems. I think a report by IPBES, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, said they estimated in a special report a couple of years ago that something like 850,000 viruses could infect humans.
Only.
And so, I think it's really incumbent on policymakers and the public to accurately see the environment that we're living in, which is one of increasing infectious human diseases. I mean, we should see COVID-19 as one in an increasing pattern of infectious disease risk. And there's another one lurking around the corner. And so we really need to get our act together and understand understand the pathogen space, but also decrease our exposure. And there's some easy things to do, but it takes countries talking to each other, and it takes leaders doing those kinds of things. But a lot of these issues, like the wildlife trade, pandemic risk in the United States, are largely bipartisan, and they are historically bipartisan. And so they're there are opportunities for these, both sides of the aisle to work together if they decide to do so. But I have found over the years that the Republican Party to be quite strong on conservation and wildlife and, these sorts of issues.
So some of the things you talk about is heightened action from the U.S. Congress and the executive branch to combat ecological and national security disruptions. What does that mean? I mean, can you translate that into something that a little more digestible? You're saying that the government should do what?
Well, I mean, in terms of Congress, the major function that Congress can play in this role is funding. I look at this issue. I don't see this as an environmental issue that we're just marketing as a national security issue to get more, eyes on it, or get more attention to it. I've looked at this issue for quite some time. It worries me deeply. I see it as a security risk, as a societal risk. But when you look at earmarks and you look how budgets are drawn in the U.S. Congress, it's woefully low especially for the return on investment, right? So things that like marine protected areas or protected areas, which we can see as a completely normally would view as an environmental preservation action, but the security payoffs are enormous in terms of what I just laid out in terms of pandemic risk and effects of human security and effects on political stability. And so we need to increase funding for what has historically been considered environmental issues. I think we need something like a 10-fold increase over 10 years in this space in terms of international conservation, disease, ecology, and pandemic prevention. And then the executive branch, they largely treat these issues as environmental issues. They don't typically rise to the level that you would involve the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, or the CIA director. But the effects on people and the effects on the stability of nations argues that it needs to be elevated in terms of executive branch action and task force and ultimately action. So internationally and domestically.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't have their attention now on pandemic issues, you'll never get it, right? And
that's right.
Although some of them still live in denial and debate about what the cause of the pandemic was, I mean, it's hard to make it exactly an ecological link because we still don't know the sources of the outbreak.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that if you accept COVID-19 is a worse example of, we've had SARS, we've had HIV, we've had chikungunya, we've had Zika, we've had MERS. These are well-established
Ebola.
Zoonotic, and Ebola, of course, 2 rounds of Ebola. These are well-known, established pandemic of zoonotic origin. And so for me, I think our evidence of some other explanation from, other than zoonotic spillover would have to be really, really compelling to pull us away from what I think is a much more obvious explanation. But in some ways, it doesn't matter whether, where it came from in terms of its effect on people. I think what it's shown is the power of, a unseeable piece of genetic material to bring massive social and economic disruption. And, in the intelligence community, we warned about these events. We warned time and again about pandemic risk. And so, I was in the intelligence community dealing with both avian flu, MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, Zika. I left before COVID-19 really rooted, but I can tell you that it seems to be a low-level issue in the security world until it happens, and then it's the most important thing.
Yeah, it brings the economy to its knees. I
Right.
mean, they just didn't get even genome sequencing funding in the U.S. I mean, the U.S. is far behind other countries even on that.
It's crazy. But one, and that's just it. I mean, I predict if in a couple of years from now, there will be people in the security community who will have a hard time convincing senior policymakers, senior officials that pandemics are a national security issue. I mean, even how as disruptive as this event has been, the capacity for people to forget and move on, it's enormous. I've seen this firsthand. Of course, COVID-19 is many times greater than what I experienced. But even people who were, watching just the churn inside of Africa. A year later, I'm talking about the Ebola epidemic.
Mm-hmm.
Just a year later, they had moved on to something else.
Last question to you: Is it? I guess a hard reality that while people like you are warning that these are national security risks, and that you have to change your national security architecture, you have to have security officials involved in planning for this.
Right.
Is it a hard reality that probably things are going to have to get worse to drive the point home, and that the environmental cost, unfortunately, in the ecological risks at the same time are so severe that we may not be able to do a 180-degree turn on some of this.
Yeah, it's difficult. I think you pinned that's really a great question because for whatever reason, and I think it's especially bad in the United States, but organizations tend to not be very good at strategic planning and mapping out scenarios and then acting on that information to steer their way through rough roads ahead. For whatever reason, we seem to need to be in a reactive mode. And with both climate change and ecological disruption, pandemic preparedness, waiting until it's on you to react is the worst pathway through.
Is there a better answer? Is it a restructuring of government? Or do we take it out of government and make climate emergency something different so that we're able to plan and head it off? Because we're not going to. We're going to wait till somebody's thirsty before we talk about clean water.
Right. I mean, partially. I mean, there's a lot of ways to answer that question, but certainly the government is not going to be able to solve these problems by themselves. It will require other elements in the public, the private sector. But without the government, we will not be able to marshal the resources and just the will to tackle some of these issues. And it really, I think, something like this really has to come from on top. And so just not to get too wonky here, but in the United States, we have lost the capacity to do long-term strategic planning that response to climate change, response to pandemics, toxification of our oceans, and and ecological disruption.
Why is that? This political paralysis, or?
I think we have moved into. I think it's partly political paralysis, but I also think, that it has not been a priority since maybe the Eisenhower years. There used to be an office inside of the White House whose only function, and they lasted in between administrations, who focused on long-term strategy. But the government is almost purely reactive now, and responds to the emergency in their inbox or on the front of the New York Times or whatever. And there are very few entities in the government who are looking at how the future is evolving.
Well, Rod, I guess maybe the only good news is that when you poll young people in Europe, or you poll people in America or Canada, for that matter, that these are big issues for younger people. So maybe they would just throw these guys the hell out until they start understanding that the environment and ecology and what you talk about, the security risks that bind us, will eventually get driven home with a new generation. Hopefully that fire is lit and it doesn't go out.
Yeah, I'm very optimistic about how quickly these generations are taking these issues on and seriously. I think they're seeing it a lot more holistically than I would have expected. They're not seeing it as climate only or inequality only. They're able to package a whole number of stresses and things that they see as problematic together, and I admire that, and I'm optimistic. My 3-year-old daughter needs that kind of attention and really a reprioritization of what's important to people and societies.
Right. I think in environmental issues, young people can really relate to them. So Rod Schoonover, the author of the report, The Security Risk That Binds Us, and also, writing that for the Council on Strategic Risks. Great to talk. Right. Thanks.
Thank you.
And that's our backstory on our fragile world. Changing so fast now, we all have to be concerned. By the way, it's the World Wildlife Fund, not Federation. I must have been thinking of the WWF, but this podcast was not about wrestling, was it? Maybe next time. That's Backstory. Please share this podcast and sign up for my daily newsletter, danalewis.substack.com. danalewis.substack.com. I'm trying to give you an idea of what to read, what's important. And in all of that, I try to list the individual source articles so you can also read them yourself. Thanks for listening. I'm Dana Lewis, reporting from London, and I'll talk to you again soon.